Okay, so just briefly, I'm going to talk about how Angela Carter subverts and challenges genre conventions in The Bloody Chamber. So to subvert means to kind of undermine, okay? So it means using those conventions in your own way to kind of make your own point, sometimes a point which is kind of the opposite of the way those conventions work in kind of older genre texts, okay? Um, so I'm mostly going to talk about The Lady of the House of Love, but these things could apply to any of the stories. So one of the ways that Carter challenges genre conventions is to mix elements of the fairy tale and the Gothic together. So quite often she uses a kind of Gothic style and Gothic um, trappings, so like setting and imagery, to tell stories with the narratives and characters of fairy tales. So what she's doing is taking a genre really kind of associated with children and making it very dark. And that's only really bringing to the surface what's always been there in fairy tales. You know, fairy tales have been kind of cleaned up for children in many ways. If you look back to older versions of fairy tales, you know, they're quite gruesome. So, for instance, The Little Mermaid, which is the kind of charming, all singing Disney film, has some horrible descriptions in it of, you know, every step that the Little Mermaid takes on land is like knives cutting into her feet. She can't speak, you know, she can never speak as long as she's on land. Or in Cinderella, in the original version, the ugly sisters are forced to wear red hot shoes and dance until they drop down dead. You know, these are quite gruesome things. And Carter kind of brings those quite gruesome, dark, gothic elements back into fairy tales in a way. So that's a little bit challenging to the genre, of course, as we know it now. As well as that, she kind of draws attention to genre conventions. So she's a little bit. If it was a film, you would call it breaking the fourth wall. You know, it's a little bit what we call in literature reflexive. Okay, so that means kind of referring to the text as a text within the text itself. Okay, so pointing out to the reader that this is a story, not a kind of real world. That it's a story, and she does that by drawing attention to genre conventions. So, for instance, in The Lady of the House of Love, she talks about how the young man could have behaved in a much more sensible way, but he couldn't do that, of course, because he is a hero, and so he has to behave like a hero. So she's drawing attention there to the kind of genre conventions that other writers might kind of hide, and therefore kind of undermining the realism of the text a little bit. Another very challenging thing that Carter does with the genre, which is very subversive, it does undermine the kind of original intention and the original conventions of both fairy tales and the Gothic, is she takes a kind of feminist reading of those genres. So in the Gothic, really, in particular, women and girls are kind of victims. They're very passive. They don't really do anything except be victimized. You know, that I talked before about how their role in the narrative is to suffer and to be at risk and in peril. Okay. In fairy tales, there are some active women, but generally in kind of modern versions of European fairy tales, they're victims. Okay, so think about Red Riding Hood having to be rescued, Cinderella having to be rescued, Sleeping Beauty having to be rescued. Okay, to be rescued is the role of women really in fairy tales as we know them now. But in Carter's versions of the two genres, the Gothic and the fairy tale, women and girls are active. They're not victims and they're not passive. They take action, okay? And also, what she does is put female sexuality at the forefront of many of the stories. So active female sexuality rather than passive, kind of victim status type sexuality. So women are not subject to kind of sexual threats in these stories. Instead, they're kind of taking the initiative when it comes to sexual activity, right? They're bold and brave. So if you think about Lady of the House of Love as being kind of version of Sleeping Beauty, it's not a version in which the heroine lies there passively waiting to be woken up by a kiss. Okay, she's actually sexually predatory and dangerous. So female sexuality is at the forefront of a lot of the stories. And then finally, the kind of symbolism that's there, particularly in fairy tales, she brings it to the surface. So some of the deeper, more implicit themes, like the threatening nature of sexuality, she brings those to the surface and makes them explicit. Okay, again, in The Lady of the House of Love, there's the kind of implied sexual theme that's there in Sleeping Beauty and that's there in vampire myths, but it's brought to the surface. Okay, so it's not hidden, it's not deep down under the surface. The reader doesn't have to kind of figure out by reading between the lines that this story maybe is something to do with sexuality. Instead, it's there on the surface. Okay, you've got this kind of sexually predatory, vampiric woman at the heart of the story. So she brings the kind of symbolism to the surface. So if we think about the wolf stories, for instance, what the wolf represents, perhaps is a kind of wildness in human beings, human beings, more kind of animalistic sexual urges. She makes that very clear in her stories rather than kind of hiding it under the surface. Okay, so subversive things, challenging things that she does with the genre, just to summarise, she blends the gothic and the fairy tale. She draws attention to genre conventions and kind of nudges the reader to remind you that you're reading a story. She makes her female characters far more active than in traditional gothic and fairy tale genre stories, and she brings the symbolism and themes, particularly fairy tales, up to the surface and makes them kind of clear and explicit rather than hidden and implicit.